The essential insight for stepping out of endless obstacle loops. That's the title. One more time. The essential insight for stepping out of endless obstacle loops. That's what we're going to talk about today. So the concept, I'm not going to bury the lead, I'll just get right into it. The concept is holding the energy open on something versus contracting or closing down on it. And the promise of this video is that by the end of it, you will know exactly what I mean. You will know exactly why this is so valuable. You'll be able to recognize all the different ways and areas in which you close down on the energy of something, whether it's a relationship, a conflict, a problem, a creation, some sort of task. There's so many different ways that we do this, and you will be able to think in these terms. You'll be able to see it in terms of allowing versus disallowing the energetic flow of something. And then as you recognize it, you'll be able to switch from disallowance into allowance and thus allow the problem to resolve itself, or for the healing to occur, or for the growth or the evolution of something to finally happen instead of just encountering the same obstacle again and again and again. I will start by defining some of the terms, which I've already begun to do, and I will ground this into a handful of examples so that you can see the different ways that this plays out. And so before we go any further, I'd like to let you know my name is Brent. I am a productivity and flow state coach. This video is a roundabout way of finding incredibly high level productivity. Very, very high level productivity in such a way that it's effortless, it is high velocity, it is sustainable, it produces the quickest and best results, it's totally holistically oriented, so we're not on some sort of burnout schedule. So if productivity and flow state is something you're interested in, then this is at the very center of that study. Please hit like on the video. Please subscribe to the channel if you've not already done so. And I highly, highly suggest that you join my email newsletter so you'll get a gift for signing up right away. It's an audio recording called Seeding New Realities. And there are tons of important insights that will be gleaned from that. And finally, consider getting coached. I offer a one-on-one coaching service, a private service. Everyone is entitled to a session for free, at least for the time being. So you can get your first session for free. And if it's your desire to learn more about the ongoing coaching relationship and everything that's possible from there, then that will be a way to learn about that as well. So we're talking here about holding the energy open versus contracting on it. Contracting is something that the ego does. The ego being a creation of the mind, it is an illusory sense of self. The ego is something that is threatened by death. It is constantly plagued by the sense of its own mortality and therefore always wants to approach life from a sense of creating safety, trying to make itself bigger or stronger or more defined or giving it some sort of definition. It's always looking to make itself more safe and thus looking to be in control and trying to find ways of controlling the unfolding of life. In the final analysis, as I believe we will see in today's talk, the control that the ego purports to have is always just illusory. It's always just imaginary. When we really look at it, when we really look, it never actually is in control. And so thus, the control mechanism, which is a form of contraction, it's a way of slowing down the unfolding of life, the unfolding of our lives in order to have it make sense or to kind of have domain over it in some way, is just a way of slowing down everything. And therefore, by moving more into a place of trust, life can pick up not just more of a velocity, but it can pick up more of an adventurous quality. It gives life this quality of being very juicy, very interesting. It very much is the type of existence, the style of existence that many of us are waiting to get to, where we can finally dive into it, we can finally experience it, where the waiting finally comes to a close. The growth of ourselves, our personal evolution, the evolution of our spirit, the evolution of our minds, the evolution of our life, all of this is something that is already happening. In one manner of speaking, it's automatic in that it's just happening on its own, the way evolution happens out in the natural world. It just happens without anybody exerting effort to make it happen. And yet it requires our participation. So our participation, or lack thereof, is what determines how smoothly or how slowly or with how much friction this process takes. So the name of the game here is keeping the energy open so that these obstacles can resolve themselves and so that we can just get on to the next thing. So this is, of course, very applicable when it comes to the subject of learning. This is the first example. So learning. I've lately taken to chess. I really enjoy chess. It's a very fascinating game. And what I notice is that if I'm doing something, say if I'm working on a puzzle that I'm trying to solve, trying to find a particular checkmate in 1 or 2 moves, I will make a few attempts at getting to the solution. And then if I get it wrong, my instinct will be to contract. And the contraction is a very basic thing. It's just like, oh, no, I fucked it up. I screwed it up. I got it wrong. And it doesn't have to be necessarily a dramatic, like, oh, woe is me, I'm such an asshole. Like, it can take that kind of form. But often these contractions are just very little contractions where we barely even notice them. We just think they're normal. We just think this is just how one goes through life. But when we make a mistake, and in this case, a mistake just simply refers to getting a result other than the one we intended to get. If a mistake is made, and we contract on it, then what you'll notice is that on one hand, the contraction happens in the body, like, you feel it in your shoulders or your back or your neck or in your head. But there's also a contraction in your mind where the mind says, no, 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 that's wrong. No, 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 that's wrong. And in particular, this element of no, no. There's a sense of pain that's generated when we contract on the energy in our mind and in our body. Not a very harsh form of pain, but a pain nonetheless, like stubbing your toe ever so slightly. Feels like that. When we do that, you can imagine that now as the closing off of energy momentarily. What's happening from an objective point of view is learning is attempting to happen. Not so much knowledge-based learning, but a sort of physical embodied form of learning where we throw something out into the world and we try something out, we give something a shot, we throw something on the wall and see what sticks, we see what we get, and then it comes back. In that moment, when we get not what we want and we contract, then the learning is stymied. This is what we can call a dirty learning loop. Because instead of just an otherwise clean loop of putting something out into the world and receiving information back to be put into our unconscious minds and internalized in the form of knowledge and learning and growth and experience, it's caught, it's snagged, it's stymied. And the learning process either slows down or it doesn't happen at all, depending on the severity of the contraction. And so therefore, what I've been practicing as I work with particular chess problems, or if I, say, work on playing a game against the computer or a human opponent, and I lose, I say to myself, good, good. It's a very strange thing to say, and the ego, of course, will want to reject this because it feels like it's in control by creating pain. The big illusion, one of many that we're dissolving today in this talk, is the illusion that the ego creates learning or growth by contracting. It will say, for example, I need to punish myself, otherwise I won't learn my lesson. That's what an ego says. And it will say, I need to feel pain if I lose in this game, because the pain is what motivates me to win. But when we create pain for ourselves, there is an echo of fear where because we're in the habit of creating pain for ourselves, we are now afraid in our own presence. We've made our own existence unsafe for ourselves. And because it's unsafe, we can't really relax, we can't loosen up, we can't ground in, we can't, and there is no longer a connection between ourselves up on the level of the conscious mind and the deeper, deeper reservoirs in the subconscious mind, the part of us that's grounded into all that is. And so that means that we can't send experience and learning back down into the ground of our own consciousness, nor can we receive new learning or new creativity or new perspective from that ground. There's a cut-offedness in the form of that contraction. Looking at it objectively, you'd ask yourself, why on earth would we do this? But the reason why we do this is because we're convinced of what the ego is telling us. It says we need to be contracted. We need to feel pain in the presence of an error or mistake in order to learn. The ego doesn't like this idea of losing a game of chess and saying, good, good, I'm glad. I'm glad it played out this way. I'm glad I lost. Because the ego would say, well, then we're just reinforcing that we like losing, that losing is good. But that's not true. We know what we want. We know that we want to learn the thing, develop the skill. We know that we want to become good at the game and win more games. That part doesn't go anywhere. That part isn't in jeopardy. And so when we say good about having lost the game or having made a mistake, we're saying good, yes, I learned. The learning is an automatic process. Another mistake that the ego makes is that it feels like it's in control of learning, like learning is something that we do consciously. Learning is an automatic process. It's like the beating of our heart or like the digestion of our food. Learning is something that is either allowed or is interfered with. What you and I do is we just gain experience. We show up, put something out into the world, and see what we get. And in this way, there's no failure. How could there be? Growth is growth. Expansion is expansion. Increased perspective is increased perspective. There's no wrong. So it's a cool way of looking at it. So we say, good, good, I didn't get what I want, great. Good, my subconscious mind is being exposed to more and more experience. So the second way that we can apply this very interesting concept of holding the energy open as opposed to contracting on it is in the area of regret and grief. Most of us, as we get older, we have things in our past that we wish didn't happen, or things that we wish we didn't do. And to look at the past and to look at how it played out and to impose a wrongness on top of it, to impose on top of it an idea that it should not have happened, is a justifiable idea. It's a very reasonable and understandable and defensible idea. But the disadvantage that we run into by doing this is that we're actually adding punishment on top of punishment. Because if there's some sort of thing that happened in the past, either happened to us or happened as a result of something we chose and did, that is one layer of the punishment right there, assuming it's something that we didn't like and something that we don't want and wish didn't happen. That's one layer of pain that's already there. And by looking at it and making it into something that's wrong adds a new layer of suffering, a new layer of pain. And so therefore, a gift that we give ourselves is dissolving at least one layer of pain over which we do have some influence. And thus we arrive at another core element of holding the energy open, which is this: letting the punishment be enough. Letting the pain be enough. It's bad enough that the thing happened. In what way are we adding to it? So as we proceed into this idea, this can bring us into sometimes very heavy territory. And so there's no need to take my word for any of this, and there's no need to internalize what I'm saying here if it feels wrong for you, or if it's making more trouble in your life as opposed to less. So use your good judgment here. But if you're feeling light around this idea, if it feels like something that would be helpful for you, then look at this thing in the past. And we're not replacing the label of bad with good. So we're not going to say this thing that happened, we're not going to say it's good, like I'm glad it happened, nor are we saying it's bad. We're stripping away the meaning from it. We're stripping away the significance of it. One way of doing this is by saying out loud, this doesn't mean anything. This doesn't mean anything. This doesn't mean anything. How does that feel in your body to hear it, to say it? This doesn't mean anything. If it feels light, if it causes relief in the body, then play with it. Here's another one. There's nothing wrong about this. There's nothing wrong about any of this. It's not that the opposite is true. We're not saying anything is right about any of this, but we're just removing the wrongness element so that it doesn't have to be anything other than what it is. When we are mentally convinced that something is wrong, then it means we've taken up a position of being against the thing. To be against something is to be in contraction about something. And again, the contraction is its own attractor field in that you'll find it on all the levels of your being. You'll find it physically. There's a physical contraction around it, mental contraction, emotional, spiritual contraction. If we're in disallowance of something. To be in disallowance of something is to state, I am unwilling to exist in the same reality as this memory, this event. But then, of course, this statement falls on deaf ears because reality will not reconfigure itself. And so if reality says, well, I'm not changing, then it means that we have to somehow project ourselves elsewhere, which is something that we cannot do. To be willing to exist in the same reality as something isn't to say that this thing is good, to say that the thing is okay, to say that we like it, to say that we're happy about it. It's a much more basic expression. It is an expression of healing, a willingness to heal, a willingness to drop an area of our mind, of our belief system, that is creating unnecessary suffering. We become clear where we are creating suffering and that it is achieving no other outcome except that, the creation of more suffering. And this is what I meant earlier when I was saying that the ego feels like it's in control. The ego feels like it's in control when it says, I'm not willing to exist in the same reality as this thing. So therefore, I'm going to stay contracted until it goes. And reality says, okay. Number 3, holding the energy open, dissolving contraction, also applies to habit correction. I'm going to relate to you a story of a client that I worked with. And this is a very unusual and sort of radical approach to doing this thing. And I'm not suggesting that you do this, but simply to take this as an instructive, an illustrative story about how this sort of concept works. So my client quit smoking recently by allowing the habit to correct itself. He had been smoking on and off for his whole life, his whole adult life. And he would start and he would stop, and he would start and he'd stop, and he'd quit and he would unquit, and he could never really quite shake it. And there would be this back and forth we would observe between the adult part of himself that wanted to be done with it and move into good habits, and the child element of himself, which is like, I just want to live for the moment. I want to just enjoy the thrill of life and smoke. And these two would never meet. One would come out at night and the other would come out in the morning. And they would always be at odds with each other, the adult self versus the child self. And so a solution that he felt was appropriate for himself was to, for the first time, smoke cigarettes, but in a way that is congruent. In a way where there's no sense of getting away with something bad, but instead a full willingness to do it consciously in the presence of both the adult and the inner child. So he said to himself, I'm just going to smoke as many cigarettes as I can, and I'm going to love it, and I'm not going to close off on it. I'm not going to make it wrong. I'm not going to make it bad. I'm just going to do this. So, okay, so away he went. Bought a pack, smoked a whole bunch on the first day, smoked a whole bunch on the second day, the third day, and then the fourth day came around, and he was holding just one in his hand, he told me. And he's like, he just couldn't bring himself to finish it. He wanted to finish it. He was trying to finish it, but he couldn't. How interesting. And so he didn't. And he threw the rest of the pack away. And he never quit. It was the damnedest thing. He never quit smoking. No decision was made in that regard. The door is just as much open now as it ever was. But he can't bring himself to do it. There's no thrill. The effect, the appeal has been lost. So this could be tried. I did just say don't do this, but you could try it on a light, low stakes habit. So if you have a heavy duty addiction, I really don't think you should do it with that. But trying it with something like, say, getting out of bed on time, getting yourself to the gym, something like developing a meditation habit or a reading habit, where the key is you give yourself something to do along these lines and give yourself a time and a place to do it. And when the time comes to do it, let's just say you have to get out of bed on time, either do it, but if you don't make it wrong. So say the morning comes and goes and you end up sleeping in. You say to yourself, good, I'm glad. Great, nothing wrong with it. And then the next day, again and again and again. And you might think, well then, if I do it that way, nothing's going to change. I'm never going to do it. But the truth is that why did you set up this habit in the first place? Why did you at all wanted to be somebody who gets out of bed on time? And then you say, well, here are all the reasons, here's all the benefits. It's like, okay, is it worth it or not? And you say, well, it probably is worth it if I can get myself to do it. It's like, okay, Well, tomorrow morning, if it's worth it, if it's worth all the effort, then do it. And then you say, well, I can't. And then I say, well, don't. And then you say, well, I want to. And I say, well, good, then do it. And so your job is to step out and look at the loop. Look at the obstacle loop. Because there's a refusal for all of the different players of yourself to come into the room at the same time. The adult walks in the room, the child leaves. The child walks into the room, the adult leaves. So bring them both into the same room. What are we doing? Are we getting out of bed on time or not? Other examples of contraction energy in relationships. Suppose you're in a relationship with somebody, or suppose you have a friendship, somebody that you relate to on a regular basis. You may notice that there are areas of your relationship that are secure, stable, you can relax and talk about whatever. And then there are certain conversations that when they come up, they get tense. And both of you tend to regress into more childish versions of yourselves. So that's friction. And maybe these problems are quite intractable in that they just do not dissolve. They just cannot be solved. They're too difficult. The energy around it is too heavy. So bring this principle at play. So you bring up the topic and make a commitment with the other person to say, all right, let's stay open. Let's keep the energy open around this. Let's talk about it. Let's watch as it happens. Let's watch as we feel the temptation to go into a childish mode. Let's commit to bringing our best selves to the table. We may or may not be able to solve this problem in a single go, so we're going to let go of the need to arrive at a decision or a solution right away. We're just going to stay open and stay grounded and stay flexible as this comes up. And if you do that, staying in a witnessing mode, as the contraction comes up, then the conflict dissolves. Maybe all at once, maybe not all at once. But you'll notice you'll get into it. I do this sometimes with my wife. We have areas of our conversation where we haven't gotten there yet. Still tense. We still take sides. We're still at odds around these things. And it'll come up and then we will both descend into our side-taking partisan kind of selves. And then we go, oh, look at that. We're going unconscious again. We will say to ourselves, oh, look at that. We're getting caught up in that energy again. And then through that meeting of our minds going meta on the thing, then the attractor field, the energy around that conflict dies down a little bit more. And we keep doing that until the conflict finally dissolves. So that's probably enough examples. So that's the concept here. So you can see now the different way the ego contracts on something. It makes something wrong, makes something bad, makes something unacceptable, and that's how it enforces its will and its power into the world. But really, it's not making anything better in any way. It's just clamping down on energy and preventing either growth from happening, learning from happening, or healing from happening. And so when you observe this now in your life, you can make this commitment to, okay, I'm going to see if I can allow whatever this is to be okay. I'm going to allow the energy to move and see what we get. And there's a final thought that I want to share here to close out with, which is a thought that has come from my experimentation with non-duality as a spirituality practice, a spiritual philosophy. And really what I've shared with you is a concept that is underneath the concept of what we're talking about here, which is holding the energy open and dissolving contraction, which is that there's no doer. There's no doer. So in non-duality, or from a place of non-dual awareness, what we would say is, there's nobody in this room. So there's no me that is like different or separate from everything else in this room. There's only just this room and nobody here. There's no separation anywhere to be found anywhere. It's all just the room. It's all just the Tao. It's all just the unfolding of phenomenal universe. And so just as the seed sprouts and is on the path of its own growth, so is this person, so is this human, if all the obstacles are removed, if there's no contraction on the energy. Even as I speak to you, in the background of my imagination, I'm just remembering that there's no speaker. There's nobody here. This is just insight that's being delivered from wherever insight comes from. There's a lot of relief that comes from experimenting with this non-dual type of awareness, and I suggest that you play with it if it's up your alley. It feeds directly into the flow state, right into productivity. It bolsters and improves everything we've discussed here. So that's just a little bit of a thread for perhaps a future discussion. So there we go. The essential insight for dissolving obstacle loops, cyclical problems, problems that don't go away. Hold the energy open. Thank you. Please hit like. Please subscribe. Sign up for my newsletter. Try out the one-on-one session while the getting is good. Thank you.